Watermelon sugar.
Jordan Brown was only 11 years old when he was found guilty of murdering his dad's pregnant fiancée, only to be found innocent 9 years later. Jordan lived at home with his dad, Chris, his 8-month pregnant soon-to-be stepmom, Kenzie Hoke, and her 2 daughters who were 7 and 4 at the time. They all lived in a farmhouse in New Beaver, Pennsylvania. Jordan and his dad were extremely close and would go hunting together almost every weekend. For Christmas in 2009, Jordan was actually gifted a youth model 28 shotgun from his father because he loved hunting so much. But on the morning of February 20th, 2009, their lives changed forever. That morning, Jordan and 7-year-old stepsister left for school at around 8:15 a.m. Every morning, they would walk to the bus stop together. 45 minutes later, Kenzie's 4-year-old daughter found her mom's lifeless body laying in bed and ran to get help. Kenzie had been shot in the back of the head, and sadly, her and her unborn son were pronounced dead. Upon investigating, police found a shotgun, specifically the one that Jordan had got for Christmas, in the home that smelled of burnt gunpowder. And initially, this was deemed the murder weapon. Authorities also found a spent shotgun shell near the path that Jordan and his stepsister walked to get to the school bus. By the next morning, 11-year-old Jordan was arrested after Pennsylvania State Police stated they found gunshot residue on Jordan's clothing. And after what his 7-year-old stepsister said during her second interview with police, she stated that she heard what sounded like a gun being fired while waiting for Jordan to get ready and leave the house with her. Although Jordan never changed his story and maintained his innocence, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and the death of Kenzie and her unborn child in juvenile court. He was sentenced to be held at juvie until he was 21 years old. Jordan's dad believed him and visited him every day. Then, 7 years later, in June of 2016, and just 2 days before his 19th birthday, Jordan was released and put on probation until his 21st birthday. But in July of 2018, his conviction was overturned and he was fully exonerated after the Pennsylvania Supreme Court found that Jordan's shotgun, which was previously thought to be the murder weapon, was not actually the murder weapon. Police initially stated that they found gunshot residue on Jordan's clothes, but it turns out that there was really no DNA or fingerprint evidence connecting him to the crime or the murder weapon. With double jeopardy laws in place, Jordan, who is now 24, cannot be retried. The only other possible suspect, and I can't find any photos of him, is Adam Harvey, an ex-boyfriend of Kenzie's. At the time, she had a restraining order against him because he threatened to kill her and her family. As of today, Kenzie and her son's murder remains unsolved. Since being exonerated, Jordan filed a lawsuit against a few former police officials over his, quote, stolen childhood, end quote. He is now studying computer science and criminal justice. He stated that while he suffers from PTSD, he is committed to turning his life around.
He turned his victims into porcelain dolls. There is a lot to unpack here, so let's just get into it. Anatoly Moskvin was born in 1966 in Russia, and he was always an unusual child. He was much smarter than everyone else around him, all the kids, and his parents didn't really think twice that he didn't have any friends or didn't socialize at all. But what they didn't know is that Anatoly had been SA'd at a very young age, and it just dramatically changed him. Oh, but it gets so much worse. At the age of 12, when he was walking home from school, he ended up being approached by 3 older men, who then brought him to the funeral of 11-year-old Natasha Petrova. Her death was suspicious, to say the least. She had died of accidental electrocution. They brought him over to her open casket and demanded that he kiss her. Now, this would be terrifying to anyone in this situation, but imagine being a young kid having no idea what's going on, and suddenly you're being forced to kiss a corpse. When he refused, they forced his head down and wouldn't let him back up until he kissed her on the forehead 3 times. At this point, the girl's mother came over and handed Anatoly an apple, which in his head was, I did a good job, I'm being rewarded. She then gave him a brass ring and put one on his finger and on Natasha's finger and said, "You are now married to my daughter." Did someone say corpse bride? He walked away genuinely believing that he was now married to this dead little girl. Anatoly then started having dreams of Natasha. She would visit him and tell him all of these things. And eventually she would say, "You need to go to the graveyard where I am going to teach you black magic. I am not going to leave you alone until you learn black magic." He was a smart kid. He knew not to go to the graveyard and follow a ghost there and learn black magic. The dreams got worse and worse, and every single night Natasha would get angrier and angrier. Eventually, Anatoly told his parents that he was having nightmares, didn't tell them anything that had happened to him, but they sent him to a psychologist who said, it's just because he's hitting puberty. That makes sense. Not at all. So the dreams didn't go away even though the doctor prescribed him sleep medication. And eventually Natasha told him, "You can put me on someone else. You can curse someone else with me, but you have to get their tooth first." Somehow, Anatoly managed to get a kid at school's tooth, and after he performed the ritual Natasha told him to perform, he never saw her again. Part 2 is going to be up right away.
True Crime to Pass the Time, Part 1. The Case of Cherish Periwinkle. On June 21st of 2013, 8-year-old Cherish, along with her 2 younger sisters and her mom, Rain, went shopping at the dollar store. While there, they ran into this man named Donald Smith, who promised to buy them clothes at Walmart with his $150 gift card, and his wife would meet them there. Rain believed she could trust Donald, so her and her daughters hopped into his van and they went to Walmart, where they shopped for around 2 hours. Soon after, Donald offered to buy them cheeseburgers at a McDonald's located inside the store. While Rain and her 2 other daughters shopped, Donald convinced Cherish to join him to go to this McDonald's, but instead he walked out of the Walmart with Cherish and she was never seen alive again. Rain put out an Amber Alert, but Cherish's body was found the next day, and it was revealed that she was SA'd and strangled. Donald was a known offender to police, and he had just been released from prison 3 weeks ago. He was soon arrested and sentenced to death.
Let's talk about the Nirbhaya case. Usually I do an on-screen trigger warning and an explanation and I leave it at that, but this case is incredibly graphic. I remember when I first heard about it in 2012, it really shook me to my core and I couldn't stop thinking about it for months. So I wanted to give you a verbal trigger warning for graphic sexual assault and rape. On December 16th, 2012, 23-year-old Jyoti Singh Pandey, and sources differ on the nature of their relationship, but either her friend or her boyfriend, Awindra Pandey, were heading home after watching Life of Pi in South Delhi. They boarded an off-duty charter bus at the Munirka bus stand. 6 other men were in the bus, including the bus driver. Awindra began to feel suspicious when he realized the bus deviated from its usual route. He began to object to the route change, and the group of men began to taunt the couple, asking what they were doing alone at this hour. A scuffle ensued and Awindra was beaten, gagged, and knocked unconscious with an iron rod. The men then turned their attention toward Jyoti. They dragged her to the back of the still-moving bus, beat her, bit her, and took turns gang raping her. Jyoti tried fighting back, and this is when the men used the rod to sexually assault her. The rod caused severe injuries to Jyoti's abdomen, uterus, intestines, and genitals. According to reports, one of the accused men admitted to having seen a rope-like object, assumed to be Jyoti's intestines, being pulled out of her body. After over an hour of this vicious assault, Jyoti and Awindra were thrown out of the bus and left to die. A passerby found the two and called the Delhi police. Jyoti was taken to the hospital and doctors discovered that she only had 5% of her intestines left in her body. Jyoti underwent 5 surgeries, the 5th removing most of her remaining intestine. She was reported to be in stable but critical condition. On December 21st, the government appointed a committee of doctors to ensure she received the best medical care. By Christmas, she remained intubated, on life support, and in critical condition. Doctors stated that she had a fever of 102 to 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and the internal bleeding due to sepsis was somewhat controlled. It was reported that she was stable, conscious, and meaningfully communicative. As she fought to survive, Jyoti gave her testimony. She walked through the order of events and ended with, "They should be hanged so that such an incident doesn't happen to another woman. They should be burned alive." On December 29th, Jyoti succumbed to her injuries and died. Awindra had some broken limbs but survived the attack. In compliance with the law, which forbids revealing the name of a rape victim unless the family agrees, the media wasn't originally given Jyoti's name, so they used pseudonyms. Nirbhaya was one of these, and it means fearless one. However, Jyoti's father said, "We want the world to know her real name. My daughter didn't do anything wrong. She died while protecting herself. I am proud of her." Revealing her name will give courage to other women who have survived these attacks. They will find strength from my daughter.
True crime obsessed people, let's talk for a second, because the craziest case that I've ever heard is so short, but it's the disappearance of Stephen Kubacki. It's February 21st, 1978, when 2 snowmobilers are driving through the Michigan Triangle on the frozen lake. If we know anything about places that have the word triangle in it, you know how this case is gonna go. As they're driving, they come across a pair of abandoned skis and a backpack. Not a good find. Fearing that the skier had fallen through the frozen ice, they call for help. So when investigators arrive on the scene, they go through the backpack and they find that it belongs to 23-year-old Hope College student, Stephen Kubacki. Stephen was a very experienced outdoorsman. This is something that he did all the time, and he had gone to this area before, so it's not like he was inexperienced. He was on one of his regular impromptu, solo trips at the time. So when he hadn't contacted people for a few days, people didn't really think much of it because that's just how he was. But just hours before the snowmobilers came across his belongings, his aunt had called him in missing because she just had a gut feeling about it. Women are the best. From his skis and backpack, there were tracks in the snow that led all the way up to a forest edge and then just disappeared. He disappeared into thin air. There was no broken ice. There was no sign of a struggle or an animal attack, nothing. They searched for Stephen for days and weeks, and there was nothing. Despite the fact there was no broken ice, investigators had to theorize that he fell through it and it froze back over on top of him. 3 months later, he was presumed dead, so Hope College awarded him his bachelor's degree in absentia. Investigators did everything they could. They even feared that John Wayne Gacy was involved, so they sent off his dental records to different police departments just if there was a John Doe. A year and 3 months after his disappearance, on May 5th, 1979, Stephen's father was working around his house when he hears a knock at the door. And standing on his front doorstep is his son, Stephen Kubacki, aka the guy that's presumed dead. Talk about freaking the hell out. He said just hours before he was on the doorstep, he had woken up on a grassy knoll in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, with no memory of what happened to him and 700 miles away from where he went missing. And yeah, that's the case.
Alright, you guys, I almost never give trigger warnings, but this one is rough. So before we get into it, just know that this case does involve violence against children, sexual assault, incest, and murder. So just please, if you're sensitive to any of those subjects, I'll catch you on a different one. Marcus Wesson was born in Kansas in 1946 to parents Benjamin and Carrie Wesson. His parents were really fanatical Seventh-day Adventists, so they were very, very, very strict and very religious. His father was an alcoholic who was allegedly abusive to his 4 children. His father also abandoned the family when Marcus was young to go be in a homosexual relationship with his cousin. He did that for 10 years and then just returned to his family like nothing had ever happened. Marcus was pretty eager to get out of there, so he actually dropped out of high school and enlisted in the Army in 1968. He was 17 at the time. He did 2 years in the Army before he was discharged. Some sources say that he was involved in combat stuff, and some say that that's not true. When he was discharged, he moved to San Jose, California, where he met a woman named Rosemary. She was 13 years older than him, and she had 8 children, and they moved in together. Also, a family member of Rosemary's, also named Rosemary, left her 7 children in Marcus and Rosemary's care. She claimed this was because she wasn't unable to care for them due to her drug addiction. 3 years later, Rosemary gave birth to her first child from Marcus, who was a son. Marcus, however, took a really disgusting interest in Rosemary's daughter, Elizabeth. He even had a fake wedding ceremony for the two of them when Elizabeth was only 8 years old. He managed to legally marry Elizabeth when she was 14 or 15 years old. He accomplished this by claiming he had her mother's permission. He was 27 years old at the time. The two of them continued to live in Rosemary's house, but they lived on one story of the house, and then Rosemary lived on the other story with her children. 4 months after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to the first of their 11 children, one of whom would pass away as an infant. One day, Marcus stole Rosemary's van, and he and Elizabeth and their children just took off. They began this really strange nomad life where Marcus didn't have a job. He just did welfare fraud. The family lived in the van for a while, but then they also lived in a tent and a tugboat, for example. And in 1986, Elizabeth's sister asked them to care for her children as well. So they had a ton of kids living with them in this lifestyle. And Elizabeth was one of those kids, to be clear.